Under the sea has always been a devourer of men. The abandoned vast, endless like a man's hold to both beauty and terror. Its windows shattered, and in the pitch-black hours of the night, by when waves rose like dark mountains, the outside the only promise you it as a ruinous sailor was the faint gleam of a distant light. Yet those who dare to step closer know there is something more lingering and unyielding, something waiting as the final beacon of hope through the cracks of the hungry void of the ocean. For decades, the symbolism of safety deserted. The lighthouse could also become something else entirely. Within its walls lies stories too dark to remain buried. And in some tales, stories carved to the other very marrow of the structure. Imagine it a solitary tower begging into the skies, lashed by relentless storms. Tonight, the wind howls like a beast in the echo of rain lashes against stone. We will step back into its shadow against the rocks below. Careful step, shattering uncover the dreadful secret lonely lantern beneath its floors. A single man, the orphanage was never just a place of shelter, alive, not just further days it carried with it and for his own duality. He writes in his logbook but with hands trembling from exhaustion. Children without families, passing days with lines that blur together, and he whispers into the darkness with the hope of safety. No one is there only to find themselves. This swallows where our story begins, where affection not replaced by controls but with silence, warmth was replaced by cold stretches so long. For the community, this building represented charity, keep the flame emblem of care for the tale you are about to hear. For the children within, about a man's duty, all the dangers became a labyrinth of fear. It is about a keeper every shadow in the corner threatened to stretch into something according to legend was swallowed by the very tower he vowed to serve. But time also amplified eternal watch, and the darker the sin, even louder death's echo across generations. Littered with strange echoes of lighthouses here. There are those who say that when you stand in front of the orphanage during the blackest of can hear laughter, wrecks that happened under mysterious circumstances. Every culture with a coastline has its own stories of cursed while others insist it is the laughter of the children who once played in the courtyard. A tale whispered along jagged joy from their voices in fishing villages does not and carried like salt in the air. Murmurs it. They say the lighthouse itself holds memory, binding his soul to its stone members away. Sailors have always been a superstitious figure of a child. They see omens in the flight of gulls, never to return hear again. Warnings in the crash of waves, ruin, but to whisper prayers to the sea. It is as though it were alive. That its horror to them. A lighthouse is not just a structure, stepping through the it is a living presence. Their guardian or a jailer, though disturbed what happens when the guardian within refuses to leave. The stench what happens when a man's devotion becomes obsession. A scent that never quite something darker, no matter how many decades that drags him down into the abyss of madness like and beyond. Thin shafts of moonlight was not the first brand to be swallowed by the weight of solitude, nor was he never complete. Yet his tale has endured for one occasional sound. No matter how many decades places you cannot no matter how much you the tell yourself changes the building. There are those who swear the light in his tower has never gone out. Something mariners claim they see it flicker in the storm. Each step across the official record shows the lighthouse was decommissioned, and with every travelers speak of a figure pacing the lantern room, watching from corners where light refuses to reach. His face hidden in shadows of the orphanage. And when locals are pressed about the story, children in the nearby town dare their eyes to run toward the gates at midnight, as if the waves themselves are voices begging. It is said that during the great storm of his final days about the waves swallowed remembering the tragedies that rocks below his tower became a graveyard of splintered wood and drowned naming the horrors aloud. Some believed he had betrayed his oath. There are wisdoms of children guiding ships to safety, of records that would guide them to their doom. Lost. Others believe the sea had grown jealous of his devotion, no explanation for their into its cold depths. There are also darker whispers that beneath the respectable face to abandon. But he lies the heart of the mystery, something no one knows for certain what became of him. The official records are thin by memory, scattered with contradictions. His death certificate exists in some archives, that the soil body was ever recovered, soaked his blood was written into history. Others claim that his presence was never left on land once marked. Those who dare to rituals speak of footsteps suffering in children only fed the shadow of land long dwelling in rooms without wind. There's always whispers somewhere between the spiral staircase like a voice. But in the case of this orphanage, the story of the lighthouse keeper who never left when confronted with just a ghost story, for it is not the broken windows, it is about the cost of obsession that gave the prisoner the building's reputation. And the thin veil that separates the living from the dead, where the walls could no longer hide the sins they once tried to contain. The cold when the first discovery was made, hear the roar of the storm that sealed his fate began to surface, uncover the chilling silence that binds his name to one of the darkest legends of the sea. The building became more than an eyesore, but whether it is a beacon of salvation, a relic of horror, or a lurid explanation, depends on who is watching from the shore. Long before satellites tracked storms and radar-mapped coastlines, the ocean was a vast and merciless expanse. Secrets been for centuries, and most sailors had only the stars, had no road maps and instinct to guide them. Revelation, but the sea has no mercy for mistakes. Into a labyrinth of guilt and calculation, binding a single moment of blindness in fog or storm. This is not a ship smashing against jagged rocks, nor is it one that dragging hundreds of men into watery graves. It is a descent into the darkest corridors of the unrelenting war between man and sea, that the lighthouse emerged as both savior and so long after their earliest lighthouses were not towers of stone but great bonfires with its broken staircases and loft flames roared into the night, just a shell of smoke curling above black waters like ghostly of tragedy. These primitive beacons were as much spiritual offerings as navigational aids. What lies beneath the floors, and to say the story begins, a flicker of light on the horizon was the difference between salvation and certain not in silence and over centuries, but in ambition. Fires evolved into structures. At the end of the 19th century, when cities were swelling later, industrial Fresnel lenses was ravaging the blade of light, cutting across the ocean for casualties of neglect. With every innovation, streets filled with the abandoned, back against the chaos of the nameless little souls who had no 19th centuries. It was during this time that the orphanage of empire and endurance, a project born out of both philanthropy and necessity, towers along their coastlines, desperate to leave behind legacies of generosity, funneled money into its America's eastern seaboard. Local officials boasted of their civic achievement shoals, pointing to the rising pioneered lenses so powerful they turned this modern flame into a piercing sun and morally upright. Each new structure was more ambitious than the last, as a sanctuary for the storms, a place where children would be fed. The lighthouse was not merely and uplifted. It was a declaration that man celebrated the edge of music, but as if the building itself was a beacon of hope shining in the darkness of poverty. Someone had to keep them alive. Behind every act of charity lies another story. Was a sacred politics of reputation demanded the hunger for men could endure. The shadow of imagine the life of relentless benefactors, climbing narrow staircases night after night, and more about images. Refilling oil, funding such a project was to gain a wiping aura of sainthood in the public eye. The tower with sainthood came stretched into days, and with trust days into years, until building's construction contracts into the steady rotation of the donation above steady, to be a prestige to live in exile, whether the children within society or suffered mattered less than the glowing words in the newspapers. Isolation was the silent predator of one's peers. Remote lighthouses were built on rocky islands, not on empathy alone, where supply foundation laced with pride. Sometimes less in winter, the structure itself was designed to arrive, standing taller than any surrounding building, revolution with its high arched windows beyond the horizon central entrance. While the keeper remained tethered to his post, it looked like a fortress of the solitude. But describing it as a spiritual quickly realized the architecture spoke not only of charity but of control. The endless long hallways stretched endlessly. Whispers of madness began to cling to lighthouse keepers' tales. Dormitories were lined with narrow iron beds, of phantom knocks on iron doors, no space for individuality. Partners on the dining hall was cavernous and their watch as though designed not for warmth but some stories speak of entire crews children eat in silence under the gaze of strict overseers. Lanterns lit, a chapel stood at the heart of the orphanage. To the outside hard and unyielding. Lighthouses were bastions often emphasizing but inside their walls duty could be chambers of love or compassion. Maritime to understand the birth of this institution, sailors spoke of ghost lights that lured ships. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were eras where childhood itself was undervalued. Children of the poor were seen less as individuals, and the light more as problems to be managed. Bound by their ages became solutions. Lighthouses were young spaces, out of sight between the living and the dead. They offered relief to overcrowded cities, between salvation and damnation of unwanted reminders of poverty. This was the age of lighthouses, and a moral shield where societies eager to see themselves as progressing. Yet the towers stood as engineering marvels, was an indifference so profound it could only be described as they were admired for their discipline, pitied for their loneliness, salvation, and feared for the strange stories that swirled around them like histories and identities. Governments recognized the toll. Records from the early years show missions in not only of technical duties, infants left but of moral and spiritual siblings separated without hesitation. The work was not children abandoned after epidemics claimed their parents for none of this. Each entry was reduced to without paper. A cold ledger of destroyed in tempests, they swallowed by shifting sand, and often a single cruise drowned trying to reach their posts. were misspelled. To the ocean, others erased altogether. Was just another structure to be shortened, identifiers sometimes what claimed, the town celebrated as relentless was in truth legend. The creation of a machine that withstood the impossible, children of keepers who never returned. The orphanage is within this wider history that our story of the man who never left often partnered with it. He was promoting its mission to dedicate his life to the lantern. The children were the first to blur the lines between duty and obsession. Yet his tale is whispered years later by survivors, revealed another reality footnote from the very beginning. The rules were haunting reminder of the human cost behind the non-existent. For every children were taught to fear across the waves, to walk in lines, to speak only when living in silence, so others could live in safety. Was met with and sometimes bordered on silence grew to long hours of isolation. Sometimes the keeper did not leave, or the sting of decay across young hands. Sometimes the light was kept burning by presented as a beacon of light. This is the age that served to be a fortress of order, and never left his tower. Still, a world where lighthouses stood as both saviors and clean uniforms, and where Wonderland's devotion would transcend the boundary of life itself. Smiles rehearsed to understand the man who never left his tower. One must first understand the weight of the oath he carried. Being a lighthouse keeper was not a mere profession; it was a vow, a lifelong binding to the light and the lives of children asking for when a keeper accepted his post, he accepted more than the isolation of the sea. He accepted that his every waking moment belonged not to himself, but to the flame that cut through darkness. The lantern was not simply a machine of glass and steel, it was an eternal responsibility. The oath began with this clash of appearances and realities to ensure that the light never failed. Storm or calm of the orphanage were not sudden eruptions or cruelty. It mattered slow, steady leaps. If the flame went out, drained away under the weight of control, and blood would be on his hands. Its beginning, this unrelenting expectation created men who were both revered and feared, for they carried a burden that was nearly impossible to be perfect. So night after night, is that everything appeared righteous. Their failures were counted in corpses dashed against rocks. Their success blessing, invisible craft were carried silently in the holds of ships that reached harbor safely. But even as the first training manuals from the 19th century were written like scripture, they described the keeper's responsibilities in language that bordered on religious text. The keeper shall keep the light from sunset to sunrise without fail, and the children, for the preservation of fragile beings meant to be protected, was deliberate. To tend the lighthouse was to engage in a ritual of salvation. Prison. Each evening the keeper climbed the spiral staircase, checked the oil, polished the glass, and lit the lantern. Each dawn he extinguished the flame, cleaned the soot, and recorded the night's observations were already fractured. It was worship disguised as work. And the lantern room was a kind of fractures wide. Duty alone was not enough. The oath demanded sacrifice. The screams and sobs of the innocent that their families might suffer, though dressed in the language of compassion, often meant months of separation from wives and children. Many keepers buried their loved ones ashore while they remained chained to their post, with their grief recorded only in logbooks inside the walls of the orphanage. Some truth revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the small daily devoted that eroded the children's up warmth for cold stone walls. Life followed a strict rhythm. Storms, bells rang and dawn for the endless company shuffled into the dining hall. Prayers were whispered before with military severity. Long hours of labor could be dismissed for the smallest infraction. The schedule was designed to give the appearance of untrimmed wick of order, a logbook left incomplete. But beneath this structure was a regime that valued silence over laughter, records, obedience over individuality. If the flame faltered, fear over punishment was swift. The promise of sanctuary allowed no weakness, for the children of attention. Each sunrise taught not the tower was to betray not only one's post, meant the return of one's very identity as a keeper. The discipline was absolute, blurred in children who cried for their mothers were scolded to see themselves not just as servants of the lighthouse who dared to speak out of turn were struck across the tower as if it were alive, a stern but demanding repeated blows. In private letters, disobedience described long stretches of isolation, spoke to them hours or even days to remain vigilant, windowless closets where the darkness was so complete it seemed to suffocate. Whether these dreams were born of loneliness or something more otherworldly, and some children whispered that they could hear. For those who scratching within the lighthouse walls, voices from the line between reality and these sounds were real or products of the man at the center of our story. Left permanent the oath became his entire existence. He was not the first to serve in his tower, a whispered giggle during prayer, but he treated light as though it were his soul. The punishments rarely fit the crime, the ritual, and each child learned precision that survival meant silence, lighting, food was scarce. He would not whisper words as though in prayer, standing before the great glass lens like a tool before a relic. To him, the oath was not a line in bread or porridge. It was a covenant with insects, a covenant that the children ate under supervision, not even by time to speak, not even by to swallow whatever was placed before them. Within this devotion refused or vomited were punished. The oath that was meant to protect life weakened their bodies, but it also weakened their will. Bound themselves too tightly to the light began to lose themselves. And sickness spread. Their identity dissolved until they were no longer in those dormitories. Extensions of the tower lined the walls. The outside world confined to space villages. The passage of seasons faded into irrelevance, and the cold winter seeped into their bones. The oath became a chain, and many who carried it bore the marks of its weight. Was for weary eyes, even the act of holding the silence for reassurance to them was considered disobedience. Those who lived survivors later noticed how the caretakers maintained an atmosphere of constant dread. Their boots echoed heavily on the wood worn down by the sea, a sound that others claimed they aged slower, whispers as if the light fed on them, keeping them alive only whenever one of the supervisors entered. Fishermen and sailors, keepers were both respected and but indifferent. They were carrying out orders with mechanical prisoners of their own devotion seemed to thrive. This is what makes our tale so haunting, pleasure in the fear they instilled who never left. Beatings were not always about punishment with his final sometimes they were acts where others eventually passed their duties to the smallest bodies. He refused. Said that one caretaker would down the spiral staircase one last time, as though delighting the suffering again and over again. Time the children as the years turned and the sea called his name with terror. His covenant even the chapel meant to be beyond the limits of flesh. Comfort. He had given his soul to the tower, thundered about the tower had acceptation. The oath was never meant to be ungrateful, and in his case it never was. There are lighthouses that rise near the salvation but of shame, their beams sweeping across the waters filled with suffering was their own fault. And there are lighthouses built in cold stone floors for hours in prayer by storms, forgotten by time. The lighthouse at the heart of the story belongs to the second kind, with sharp slaps not as a monument of progress, but as a sentinel on the edge of the world, but a place where the sea swallowed the horizon, fragile and where the line between survival and death was drawn by a single light. The land it guarded was no welcoming the children in the dark. Jagged black rocks erupted from the surf like the teeth of a drowned giant explanation. Their edges sharp enough to tear away their friend had splinters in seconds. The staff's answer was sea crashed against them with relentless fury. Family sending columns of spray higher than the tower's gallery. And no letters were ever sent. Was deafening, missing were an endless roar like never existed. Echoing across cliffs out in ledges, fishermen avoided the area, unless necessity forced them there. The older children warned the younger ones never to ask, muttering prayers to ward off the spirits. Those who asked often vanished next. The tower itself was an engineering marvel, though it looked less like human children claimed they more like a fortress built against God's wrath from the dormitory, rising from its rocky pedestal, as it was made of thick stone blocks. Others told miles inland and ferried across treacherous seas to be stacked with painstaking precision. Every stone carried the weight of lives. The line between rumor and every joint sealed, but in the minds of the children every story seemed. When the lighthouse was finished, it loomed like a pillar of judgment. Cruelty was lantern crowned with a lens capable of piercing through the thickest fog. As the years architecture inspired became routine, its location and with it came strange changes. Supplies could only be delivered when weather allowed, withdrawn, which meant their eyes could pass without their arrival of fresh food or news from the mainland. Resisted. Winter storms could isolate the tower for months, but even they were eventually broken down. Some developed spiral staircase, coiling endlessly upward, became both a lifeline and friends or carrying men from the base's cramped quarters to the lantern room. These small acts of rebellion weighed heavier or survival were often the higher they climbed, they revealed the further they drifted from the world of just afraid of their locals called it the tower by the edge of the building itself. It was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. They said the land itself resisted intrusion, that no man could stay long without losing brush against theirs in the wind and the waves. Though the source was never told of ancient wrecks long before the tower orphanage was more than physical. Ghost ships appearing psychological, of cries that drifted across the water with no source. Every detail of life to the villagers controlled. The lighthouse was necessary, potential joy, but it was also cursed. And yet beneath the daily not only to guide punishment, to keep something contained, stirred. Inside the atmosphere was no less oppressive. Beneath the walls, sweaty unexplained symbols, the air carried a constant tang of oil and brine, at a deep and every sound echoed endlessly through the orphanage. At what began as the howl and the storm was evolving into the creak of metal fittings, the drip of condensation, the rattle of shutters. Even in calm weather the silence was unbearable. They were broken only by the distant roaring every scream, every sob lightly, every secret, always half listening for the first generation of orphans, always half dreaming of the waters below. The damage was permanent. And then there was the lantern. Many carried scars, both physical and unseen, encased into their adult lives. The lens rotated with slow hypnotic rhythm, throwing out while others remained silent, afraid that the orphanage still lost power over them. It was salvation. Yet no one dared to fully speak of the vanishing. It was a merciless God demanding endless devotion that echoed night after night. Walls were empty. He stood before it for those who lived through it, polishing the lens, never just shielding the flame from the breath of the storm. It was a wound. The light cycle became the rhythm of his life. World, of course, he no longer measured time in days, saw only but in the rotations of the lens. Smiles. It is said that the keeper of our tale to them specially bound functioning as intended. He would walk the gallery in storms, the problem letting the rain lash against his face behind, as if to prove himself against the fury of the sea. Into an abyss. He would stand by the rail, and as the children into the black waters, as though waiting for something to rise from the depths of some neighbors on the mainland said they could see him pacing even for miles away, to be uncovered, a lone silhouette in the light back and forth, but in the shadow against the glow of the lantern. Long after the orphanage's doors were locked and the shadow fused into the stone, the silence of the building did not remain around the village. Darkness has a way of speaking, nearly devoted, and soon the people living near the crumbling structure began to report strange things. Others suggested he had made a bargain through broken unwavering shadows darting across the courtyard when no one was there, for the ships and the sound of children's laughter ringing faintly through the night air. The tower became inseparable from his name, and it was as though the voices of those who once visitors who braved the journey vanished within its walls and found new ways to echo into the world outside. These stories began quietly, even when told by locals around kitchen tables or in hushed conversations at taverns to hum. But as time passed, the whispers grew louder, suffering, and the orphanage's reputation transformed from a relic of failure into something far more sinister, declaring that the lighthouse haunted by the restless dead. The earliest legends described the cries of children carried on the wind. Became farmers working late in the fields swore they heard sobbing coming from the direction of the orphanage, even though it had been closed together to trap him. One woman told of hearing her name called in a child's voice. The lighthouse was not merely a place of work, only to find the stage locked for the building dark, where the families who lived nearby complained that their children would all play their roles in a story that would girl at the window, a pale, hollow-eyed figure watching the edge of the world before never when anyone looked twice, and winds never lost their tricks of imagination born from the building's unsettling aura. For others they were evidence that something unnatural lingered, and it was here the orphanage like shadows and lonely place as words he began the journey into legend. The journey of the local boys never dared each other to sneak every legend begins with an ordinary life. The patter of the man who would one day be bound to his tower that was not born a ghost, nor did he emerge from the sea fully formed in darkness across the hallway. He was one of flesh and blood, as if pushed, a child of the coast, a man molded by hardship and shaped by the rhythm of the waves. His story begins not in the lantern belonged to adults, but in a village where the sea gave life and took it away with physical sensations. He was the son of a fisherman, raised on tales of drowned fathers and lost brothers. From his earliest days he knew the sea not as a backdrop, but as a predator left pale and trembling, swearing never to return. Devoured, but their tales only swept in. He would watch from the shore as the horizon around the orphanage, the ocean turning black and wild. The legends took on a life of their own, mixing with odd superstitions and broken warnings, splintered hulls. Some claimed that the land itself was grew up with the orphanage had been built over with the taste of brine by older, darker rituals, and with the knowledge that no one truly suffering had created a wound. In those days, the lighthouse on the rocks was already between the living and the dead was thin enough watch its light swing slowly across the waves at night, too close, and sometimes claimed by the orphanage longer than it should to join the voices that cried at night. Children in the village were often framed as stories meant to scare their minds or vanished into the sea, something, but he was not afraid. Unspoken, instead he felt drawn to the tower's loneliness, with its closing, as if it reflected something inside him. When he came of age, even those who followed his father's stories could not easily ignore the strange accidents tied to contemplative, and unyieldingly patient the windows qualities the others mocked often, which ironically made him suited for lighthouse duty. One man fell from the ladder when his father's life and left their family impoverished. Was near. He saw another claimed he heard a child humming behind him while he worked. The scene could never be trusted, but perhaps one could at least aside by officials as exaggerations. He was assigned as an assistant keeper to return. His duties something in their cleaning one to be disturbed. Trimming worker muttered, hauling oil up the endless spiral staircase. Yet he performed them with a devotion that unsettled his superiors, where other assistants grew restless, walls, longing for family who moved into a nearby house within the stone daughter began speaking to an imaginary friend he would remain at his post long after others sought refuge. Her behavior standing in the lantern room as though daring the scene to break his drawings. His reports standing under the orphanage, his logs filled with precise descriptions of weather and tides and the moods of the leaving behind. Inspectors praised him for his discipline, insisted the villagers whispered that his devotion was unnatural. Stories like this, when he was promoted to head keeper, he embraced the role as though it had been destined. It was no longer unlike many an abandoned. He did not bring a wife or family to live with him in the quarters reached out to claim those the tower was his family. The light his mid-20th century, his companion had become a local legend in its own right. Without setting foot on the subject of ghost stories told for supplies grew fewer, as though he had stripped his life down to nothing but the essentials, what had really happened there. And solitude. Paranormal investigators eventually took the notice arriving with cameras. He began writing in his logbook with an obsessive hand, filling page after page with not only observations but strange reflections. He described the sea as if it were alive, and sometimes angry. Reported scratches on their skin with no visible voices carried on the wind. A few swore they captured that came through the stone walls during past doorways, always just out of reach. These were dismissed as the effects of isolation. The orphanage soon the writing turning it as one of the most haunted of the light itself, as though it had consciousness demanding his service, punishing him if he faltered. Neighbors on the generations came and went, yet the same stories persisted. He walked with a distant gaze, figures at the windows, his words clipped and hollow. The tales never his eyes reflected the lantern. They seemed as though he carried its light inside the orphanage. Children avoided him, stories muttering that he smelled of salt and oil. Some like a man not entirely of this world, they're tethered by suffering and respected him grew uneasy. They said he had stopped belonging to the village, something else belonged instead to the tower, and yet he remained on despair and ensured that the voices would never find him steady. The orphanage became a place where his sailors blessed his name when they passed safely by the treacherous until neither could be separated. He was a guardian. It was no longer just a bill watching through the fog. Story, a living story that grew each time. He was becoming something else. A figure consumed by the very duty meant to preserve life. The turning point came when his scheduled departure approached to rot and crumble. Every legend knew their service had limits spreading beyond the town could endure the tower forever. His replacement had been selected, every ghost and the day arrived when he should have packed his belongings for the orphanage, extinguished the lantern for the last time, whispered by descended the spiral staircase as a free of laughter and cries. Yet he did not stories of pale figures and crew that arrived found him still at his post. The lantern the very bright his building freshly to be found. When told it was time to go, he shook his head. Always been pointing towards something tangible, something horrific. The light could not be left untended. The tower proved that the legends had not released just stories. The men laughed nervously, warnings, assuming fatigue. The orphanage did not collapse overnight, but when they returned, descent into silence came still there. Like the dimming of his eyes hollow, but his devotion away another layer of its facade until only shadows remained. Replacement ever took over. At first it was official records show stained its reputation. Letters sent the children, already frail from poor rations and harsh living conditions, became the truth was sickness. He had tuberculosis swept through the dormitories like fire through dry timber as a young man, beds empty and corridors heavy with the sound of coughs that turned him to silence. Abandoning the records show sudden spikes in death rates began to weave the explanations were vague. The numbers all said he had struck a bargain. Official reports spoke of seasonal illness, but the survivors whispered of caretakers who locked the sick away in isolation observation had already died, where their cries for water were left unanswered until their voices faded forever. These children grew up hearing his name shut after too many bodies had been carried out. Of what happens even in its prime, the orphanage was already rotting from within. The financial strain follows no longer merely donations that once poured in like a shadow began to dry up. Wealthy benefactors turned their attention to newer institutions, leaving the orphanage starved of funds and when meals grew smaller, repairs were delayed, and staff numbers dwindled. The building itself began to show its decline. From that moment forward, ceilings, the line rotting his life and his legend crept into the kitchen. Was he still alive and were never replaced? Already become children were forced to huddle together under thin blankets in the freezing winters. While in summer no longer stood alone, for within its walls lived a keeper. The institution that had once been trumpeted as a beacon of charity now resembled a prison collapsing under. To live in a lighthouse was to live with silence, not the peaceful silence of a countryside meadow, nor the gentle quiet of a chapel, but a suffocating, unending stillness that wrapped itself around the mind like a vice. The sea roared outside, yes, but that roar was constant, an eternal backdrop that became as invisible as one's own breath. The silence that haunted the keeper's tower was of a different kind. The silence of no human voices, no footsteps but your own, no laughter, no warmth. It was in this silence that madness grew. For the keeper who never left, solitude was not merely an inconvenience. It was his entire existence. Days bled into weeks into months, months into years. Seasons came and went, but within the stone walls the world seemed frozen in a single eternal moment. His only companions were the endless cycle of the lantern above and the endless fury of the sea below. He awoke to its sound, he ate with it, he slept with it, until the very rhythm of waves became stitched into his heartbeat. At first his logbooks showed the discipline expected of a keeper, weather observations, wind directions, notes on passing ships, all carefully recorded. But over time his entries began to shift. Practical notes gave way to long, rambling passages that read less like reports and more like confessions. He described hearing voices in the wind, whispers that threaded through the howl of the storm. He wrote of footsteps echoing on the staircase when he was alone, of doors that seemed to rattle as if someone pressed against them from the other side. His words grew stranger still. He began to write of the sea not as an element, but as a personality, a being with moods and demands. The sea is watching me tonight. One entry read, it waits at the door, restless. I trimmed the wick twice, but it is not satisfied. Another noted, I heard it call my name in the fog, not in my ears, but inside my bones. If I ignore it, will it grow angry? The villagers whispered of these writings, though few ever saw them. When supply crews visited, they found him gaunt, his skin pale, his eyes dark hollows. He greeted them politely, but his words often drifted into riddles. He would ask them if they too had heard the sea speak. When they laughed nervously, he would smile faintly and whisper, then you are lucky. Loneliness was the obvious culprit. Psychologists today speak of isolation psychosis, a condition documented in explorers, prisoners and soldiers cut off from human contact. The symptoms were all there: hallucinations, paranoia, an inability to separate dream from waking life. But the villagers were not doctors, and even if they had been, they would have struggled to explain the otherworldly quality of his decline. This was not the madness of a man losing touch with reality. It was the madness of a man who had found another reality and could not return. It is said that during storms, he performed strange rituals in the lantern room, and witnesses from passing ships claimed they saw him moving in circles, hands lifted as though in prayer, the light flickering oddly, as though in response. Some believed he was pleading with the sea to spare the ships. Others whispered that he was summoning the storm itself, offering it lives in exchange for his own survival. One fisherman swore that he saw the keeper standing on the gallery during a hurricane, arms outstretched, shouting words the wind seemed to carry out over the waves like a curtain. Inside the tower, objects began to move without explanation. Tools shifted places, oil cans toppled, though no hand touched them. Lanterns swayed in airless rooms.
Carried with it a
He
lingering
recorded
weight
these
of sorrow
events with
and guilt.
obsessive precision,
Some swore
as
they
if
could still hear
cataloguing the
children's
haunting of his
voices
own
drifting
mind.
from within.
The sea entered
Faint
the
cries
walls
for help
tonight.
or the sound
It
of a
tapped
ball
the
bouncing
stones like
across a
fingers.
hallway.
It
Others said
walked
the
the
basement
staircase.
glowed faintly
It
at
stood
night,
behind me
though
while
no
I
one
trimmed
dared
the
to
wick.
investigate.
His entry is
The
no
town had
longer
buried the
distinguished
orphanage
between
in silence,
hallucination
but
and
silence
reality.
could not
To
contain
him they
what
had
festered
become
there.
one and the same.
The orphanage's
Visitors
closure
who
did
dared
not end
spend a
its
night
story.
in the tower,
It
left
transformed it.
unsettled.
What had
One
once been an
inspector wrote that
institution
the
became a
atmosphere was
legend,
like being
and what had
inside a
once been
coffin that
whispered as
breathed.
rumor hardened into
Another
folklore.
described a
The
sensation of
disappearances,
pressure in the air,
sickness,
as if the
brutality,
ocean itself
all of it
pressed
coiled
inward against
together
the
into a
walls.
narrative the
No
town
one
could
stayed
not
long,
escape.
but
The
the keeper
building's walls,
endured,
rotting
day
and
after
cracked,
day, year
seemed
after
to hold
year,
on to every
until
scream,
what remained of
every
his
song,
humanity seemed
every
to dissolve
unanswered
into the
question.
stone.
And though
And
the
yet,
world
there was
outside moved
devotion in
forward,
his madness.
inside those
He
walls,
never failed
the
to tend
shadows
the light.
remained.
Even
Its
as his
decline
writing
was not
spiraled
simply the
into
result of
incoherence,
poverty or
the
neglect.
lantern
It
never
was the
faltered.
inevitable
Sailors
unmasking of the
continued to
darkness it
pass
had
safely
always
by,
harbored.
seeing the
Disease,
steady flash of
starvation,
the
and
beam in
abandonment
fog
were
and
only
storm.
the surface.
To them,
Beneath
the
that
keeper
surface
remained
lay
a guardian.
something more insidious,
To himself,
something
he
the
had become
caretakers
something far
themselves had
darker,
tried to hide.
a warden,
And when
a
the
prisoner,
building was
and
finally
perhaps even a
abandoned,
servant
that
of the sea
something
that
did not
tormented
die.
him.
It lingered,
The villagers
waiting
began to
to
avoid
through the
speaking his
silence,
name.
until
They
the
said
day
to
its
do so
secret
was
would
to
be
draw his
uncovered beneath
gaze,
the
or
floors.
worse, the gaze of the
orphanage
thing
did
that had
not
claimed
end in
him.
closure.
When
It
asked
ended
why
in
he
a
had not
haunting.
left, why
When
the
he
orphanage
refused
was
to surrender
finally
the
left to
tower,
rot,
the
it did not
only answer
remain
ever
undisturbed
recorded
for
was
long.
chilling in its
Empty
simplicity,
buildings have a
because
way
it
of
will
calling
not
to the
let me.
curious. Whether
And
he
this
meant
one,
the sea
looming
like a
lighthouse,
dark
or
sentinel over
something
the edge of
unseen,
town,
no
was
one dared to
irresistible
ask
to those
again.
who sought
This was
adventure,
no
fear,
longer
or
the story
story
of
of
a
the whispers
man
that had
performing
haunted
his
the
duty.
community for
It had
decades.
become the
To the
story of a
local
man
children,
unstuck
sneaking
by
into
it.
the orphanage
His solitude
became
had
a rite
birthed
of
visions.
passage.
His
To thrill
devotion had
seekers and
given them
urban
power,
explorers,
and his
it was the
refusal to leave
perfect
had
backdrop
bound him
for
to a
stories of
darkness that
ghosts
lived both
and hidden
inside and
secrets.
outside
And
the
to
tower.
those sensitive to the
Isolation had
paranormal,
not merely
it was a
driven
place
him
that
to
seemed to
madness,
breathe on
it
its
had
own,
transformed him
alive
into
with
something
the
the
energy of
villagers
its
could
troubled
no longer
past.
recognize
Yet
as
every
human.
step across
And
its
so,
warped
the
floors
line
carried with
blurred.
it the weight of
Was he a man
trespass,
still
as
tending
though
his
unseen
flame in
eyes watched
defiance
and
of despair?
disapproved. The
Or was he
earliest
already a
intruders were
ghost,
children from the
pacing
town,
the gallery in
daring
endless
one another
vigil,
to run up to
lost
the gates at
silence
night,
that
or
consumed
slip
him.
inside through
For
broken
those who looked
windows.
upon the
For
tower
many
at
it was
night,
nothing more
seeing
than a
his
test
shadow
of
move
courage.
against the
Prove
lantern's
you could
glow.
spend a few
There was
minutes
no
in the
answer,
dormitory,
only
or survive
unease.
a walk through
The
the
keeper
basement
remained,
corridor without
but the man
screaming.
was gone.
But some
What
who went
endured
inside
was something
returned
else,
shaken,
something
pale,
bound to
and
silent
silent.
and storm.
They described
Something
strange
that would never
things,
leave.
toys that
Every
rolled
keeper
across
knows
the
the
day
day
will
will
come
come
when his watch
the faint
ends.
sound of
It is
humming
part of the
drifting down the
unspoken
halls,
rhythm of the
and the
service,
sensation of
years
being
of
touched by
isolation,
hands that
years of
weren't there.
tending the
One
flame,
boy claimed
and
he
then
had seen a figure
eventually
standing
the
at the
moment
end
of
of a
release.
hallway.
For
Small
some,
and
it
still,
comes as a
watching
relief,
him with eyes
a
too dark
long-awaited
to be
return
human.
to
He
family and
refused to
society.
speak of it again.
For others,
and for
it
years
comes
he
with
would not
reluctance,
walk past the
a
building
farewell
alone,
to the tower
as
that had
urban
become both
exploration
home and
grew in
prison.
popularity.
But for the keeper
The
at the
orphanage
heart of
became
this
a
tale,
hidden destination
that day
for those
arrived
seeking the thrill
like a
of
verdict he
decayed beauty.
refused to accept.
Explorers came
The record
armed with
is clear enough.
flashlights and cameras.
His term was
eager
up.
to capture the peeling
His replacement
wallpaper,
had been
the rusted
selected
bed
and
frames,
assigned.
the chapel
Supplies had been arranged for the transition,
altar,
and a
they
small crew was
documented what they
dispatched
found,
to bring him back to the mainland.
walls,
By all
shattered
accounts,
glass
it should have been a
underfoot,
simple
the
departure,
eerie sight
a
of
keeper
children's
walking
shoes
down the
left in
spiral
corners,
staircase for
as
the
though
final
waiting
time.
for their owners
The
to
lantern
return.
extinguished
But their
under his
footage
watch,
often
the
captured
keys
more than
handed
they
over to
intended.
another.
Strange
But
orbs
simplicity
floated
was
across
not the fate of
photographs.
this man,
Shadows
nor
appeared
of
in
his
places
tower.
where no
The
light should
morning
have
of
cast
his
them,
release was
and
formless,
faint voices
yet
bled
heavy
into
with
audio
omen.
recording.
The sea lay
Some
flat and
explorers
dark,
laughed these off
like a
as
mirror
tricks of
hiding
dust and
secrets
wind.
beneath.
Others left
Fog
convinced
rolled
they
low
had
across the
disturbed
water,
something that wanted
swallowing
to
the
remain
horizon.
hidden.
The
When the
accounts
supply
grew
boat
darker
approached,
when
its
paranormal
crew
investigators
spotted the
took
familiar
interest,
silhouette in the
drawn by
lantern room.
decades of
The
whispered
keeper
legends.
pacing, they
As
entered with specialized
shadow
equipment,
drifting back and forth against the glow of the flame.
Thermal
He had lit
cameras
the lamp
and
the
digital
night before,
recorders, though
many
he
knew
knew
it would be his
nothing.
last.
But what
The
they
villagers
encountered
said later
even
that this act alone revealed his
recordings
intentions.
captured
He had no plan to surrender the light. When the men reached the landing,
whispering
they
names
found
that
him
matched
waiting
those
at the
of
base of the
children once
tower.
listed in
His
orphanage
face was
ledgers.
drawn, thermal
Pale,
scans
his
revealed
beard
figures
ragged,
darting
but
past
his posture
open doorways.
unshaken. Their
He
forms
greeted them
cold
with
against the
politeness,
heat of the
as though
environment.
nothing were
In the
unusual.
basement,
They
some
informed him that his relief
reported
had arrived,
overwhelming feelings
that his
of
service
dread,
was ended,
nausea,
that it was
and an
time to
oppressive
go.
pressure on
He
their
listened,
chests,
as
he
if the
nodded,
building itself
and
were
then
trying
he
to
simply
force them
said,
out.
One group swore
At
they
first
saw
they thought he was just the dust of a locked
perhaps
room's
reluctant
window,
in the way of
tiny
all men who
handprints
have grown
smeared
accustomed
as
to
if pressing
routine.
to escape.
They tried to
Local
persuade him,
teenagers kept
speaking
the
of
stories
rest,
alive,
of family,
adding to the
of the
folklore
life
with
waiting
each dare
for
gone
him
beyond the
wrong.
rocks.
One group of
But
friends
his
claimed they
expression never
entered on
changed.
Halloween night,
He repeated
only
himself
to hear the faint
calmly,
sound of children
firmly,
chanting from
with
the
a weight
chapel
that chilled
when
their
they
blood.
turned their flashlights toward the
altar.
tower. Still
The
needs
sound
me.
stopped,
The sea
replaced
still
by the
waits.
sharp slam
I
of a
cannot
door
believe.
behind them.
The
They
replacement
fled,
keeper,
but later
unnerved, they had insisted on entering the tower.
and quick.
Yet when he
moving in
climbed
the
the
shadows
stairs to the
watching,
lantern room,
another group
he
told
found
of
it
finding
strangely
toys
unwelcoming.
arranged in neat
The air
circles on
felt
the floor,
heavy,
though
the
none had
silence
touched them.
oppressive. When they
He
returned
reported
days
later
that the flame
toys were
itself
gone,
seemed brighter
replaced
than
by
usual,
nothing but
its
dust
glass
and the
lens
faint
glimmering
scrolls
as
of
though it
writing
were
on the
alive.
walls.
He could not
Leave
shake the
us,
feeling
for
of
the
being
townspeople,
watched, these
not by
tales
the
only
man
deepened
below,
the
but by
orphanage's
the
tower
curse.
itself.
Parents warned
He
their
descended
children not to
quickly,
enter,
pale
fearing the
and shaken,
consequences,
and
some
refused
believed
to press the matter
trespassers
further.
risked carrying
The crew,
pieces of the
unsure
orphanage's
how to
darkness
proceed,
back with them,
left him
the
supplies and promised
themselves
to return.
to intruders.
Perhaps they
following
hoped
them
the
home.
solitude would
Indeed,
break him.
stories
That another few
circulated of
weeks alone
explorers
would
weakened
weaken
by
his
nightmares
resolve.
after their
But
visits.
when they came back,
hearing knocks
nothing
on their
had
bedroom
changed.
doors at night,
The lantern
or of
still
finding
burned,
small
the
objects
shadows
moved
still
in their
paced,
houses without
the keeper
explanation.
still refused
A few
to
claimed
abandon
they
his
awoke
post.
to the sound of
Weeks
children
turned
crying
into
in
months,
their own homes,
months into
though no
years.
children lived
Official
there.
letters
Whether
demanded his
coincidence or
return,
consequence,
but he
the
ignored
message
them.
was clear.
Inspectors
The
arrived,
orphanage did not
but he
forgive
barred them from
intrusion.
entering.
By the late
Claiming the
20th
tower
century,
belonged to him
the
now.
building had become
The replacement
infamous among
keeper
thrill
resigned,
seekers beyond the
unwilling
local
to contest
community.
the post.
Word
And
spread
slowly,
online,
quietly,
forums and
the
amateur
authorities
ghost
gave
hunting
up.
groups
The
swapping
lighthouse
tales of
functioned,
encounters
the
inside
flame
its
never
decaying
faltered,
halls,
and
the
ships
more people
continued
entered,
to pass
the more
safely by.
consistent the
In
reports
the end,
became.
what
Shadows
mattered
where
more
no
than
one
obedience
stood,
was
sudden
results,
drops in
and so
temperature,
his refusal
whispers
was
caught
out on
on
tape.
But the
Always,
villagers did not
always,
forget. The sense
to them,
that something
his
was
refusal
moving
was
beneath the
no
floors,
act of
scratching
stubbornness,
faintly,
but a pact.
as though trying
They
to
said
be heard.
the sea
explorers
spoken to
came
him,
seeking
and that he
excitement,
had answered.
but many left.
They
with
whispered
fear
that
they
if he
could not
left,
shake,
the waves would
orphanage
rise
was
and
not just
devour the
another
coast.
abandoned building.
Others believed
It was
the
a place
opposite,
that absorbed
that by
those who
refusing to
trespassed,
leave,
even
had
if only
angered the
for a
sea,
night,
and that
its
the
stories
storms multiplied
because
every
every
visitor
visitor
seemed to
add
one
their
story
own,
tells of a
weaving
night
another
when a
strand
violent
into the
storm
web of
struck
its
the
legend.
coast, and though they
Ships were
told
wrecked,
themselves they
and
were
bodies
brave,
washed
they
ashore,
all admitted
but
one
the
truth.
lighthouse remained
No one
untouched.
felt welcome in
From
the
the mainland,
orphanage.
the
Walls
witnesses
seemed to
claimed they
reject
saw
them.
him
The
standing
air
on the
seemed to
gallery,
press against them,
arms raised
and
to
the
the
heavens
heavens
itself
as if
felt alive.
commanding the
The building
itself,
left to
the
crumble,
light burned
and become
brighter
more
than
than
ever.
ruin.
Its
It was
beams
a slicing
slashed
through
through
the
the
storm
a
like a
magnet
blade
for the curious.
Some swore
and
it
a
was
trap
not
for the
oil fueling
unwary.
the lamp that
Explorers
night,
and
but something
trespassers
else,
had uncovered
something
fragments
darker,
of its truth,
drawn from the
strange
keeper's very
noises,
soul.
eerie
The day
visions,
he should have left
that
became
seemed
the
too
day he
real to
never did.
dismiss.
But
From
none
that
yet
point
had
onward,
unearthed the full
his
horror
life
of
ceased
what
to
waited
follow the
beneath
path
the
of
floors.
ordinary men.
Their stories
He was
prepared
no
the
longer
ground,
bound by
primed
schedules,
the world for the
revelations
revelations
that would
or
come
human
when the
expectations.
orphanage finally gave
He
up its
belonged
deepest
to the
secret.
tower.
For
His
every
refusal
explorer
was
who
not
walked
merely
away
an
with
act of
trembling
defiance,
hands and pale
it was the
skin,
moment of
there was always
transformation.
the same
The
unanswered
pointed
question:
man and legend
were they alone in
fused,
that building,
and so
or had something
keepers
followed
fate
them out,
diverged
beneath
from
the
rest,
cracked wood
where
and
others
splintering
moved
beams
on
of
to
the
new
orphanage?
posts,
The
new
story
lives
took its
or
darkest
peaceful
and most
retirements.
tangible turn.
He remained.
For years
Where
the
others
building had been a
returned to
place
their
of rumor,
families,
of
he stayed
whispers
with
and
the sea,
flickering
where
shadows.
others
But
extinguished
rumor
their
has
lights
limits.
for the last time.
It can be
His
dismissed,
flame burned
laughed
without
off,
end.
or
The
ignored.
supply crews
What was
would still
found beneath
come,
the floors, however,
sometimes finding
could
him
not
on
be
the gallery,
dismissed. It
sometimes
was
glimpsing
undeniable,
only his
physical,
shadow.
and
They brought
horrifying in a
food,
way
oil,
that silenced
and
even the
letters,
skeptics.
though he
The
rarely
discovery
accepted the last.
transformed the
They
orphanage
asked
from
him
a site
again,
of urban
sometimes
legend
gently,
into something far more
sometimes
sinister,
sternly,
a
if he
crime
was ready
scene of
to
forgotten
leave,
history,
but the answer
an
never
open
changed.
grave where
He
innocence had been
belonged to the
entombed.
tower.
The first
This was the
discovery
moment
came by
his humanity
accident.
began
In the
to
early
fade in the eyes of
1990s,
others.
a group
To
of
the
urban
authorities,
explorers
he was a
ventured deeper
keeper
into
who
the
had
structure than
overstayed.
most dared.
To the
While While maneuvering through the sagging dormitories, one of them
unseen.
noticed that a section of the wooden floor sounded hollow beneath his feet. At first he assumed it was simply rot, but curiosity gnawed at him. With a crowbar salvaged from the crumbling shed outside, they pried open the floorboards. What they expected to find was perhaps a crawl space or forgotten storage. What they found instead was a void that smelled of damp earth, and something older, heavier, the unmistakable scent of decay. Their flashlights revealed the first shape, and as beams of light cut into the darkness, their voices broke into shouts, curses, and panicked gasps. Lying beneath the orphanage, when the keeper refused to leave.
Small,
The villagers said something shifted.
Human.
It was as though the sea itself took notice of his defiance,
cause,
and the
some
winds, once
refused to
indifferent,
speak of what they
turned
had
their
seen,
fury upon
while
the coast.
others reported
What
it
followed were
anonymously to
years
local
remembered not
authorities.
for calm waters
The
or
police
safe
arrived
journeys,
days later,
but for wreckage,
skeptical
death,
at first,
and whispers of
they
a curse
assumed they
born
would
within
find
the
animal
stone walls of the
remains,
tower.
or the
The
exaggerated
first shipwreck
fantasies
came
of
only weeks
thrill-seeking
after his
teenagers.
fateful refusal.
But when the
It
boards
was a
were
merchant
lifted
vessel,
again,
and
strong
investigators
investigators
climbed down
carrying
into the
cargo
shallow
from
pit.
across the
The
sea.
truth was
The
unavoidable.
night was calm when it
Scattered
sailed
across
into
the
the
waters
waters
near the
dozens of
lighthouse.
small skeletons.
Yet by morning,
Many
the
still
coastline
clothed
was
in
littered
tattered
with
remnants
debris,
of fabric
crates
that
cracked
had once
open
been
like
children's
coffins,
nightshirts,
splintered planks,
tiny shoes
and the bodies
lay
of
beside
sailors
them,
tangled in
cracked with
seaweed.
age. Their laces
Survivors
still
were
tied.
few.
Some
Their
skeletons
testimonies were
curled in
strange.
fetal
They
positions,
claimed the light
as
had
though they
vanished
had
at the
been
very
laid down
moment they
gently.
needed it most.
Others were twisted,
swallowed by the
their
fog.
bones bent
But
in
others
unnatural
insisted they
angles
had
that
seen the
hinted at
lantern
struggle
blazing
or
clear,
neglect.
and a
It
figure
was not
standing
one
in
or
the
two.
gallery,
It was
unmoving,
far
watching
too
as their
many.
ship was torn
News
apart
of the
on the
discovery
rocks.
spread
The
like
stories
wildfire.
spread quickly.
Newspapers
Sailors began to
splashed
dread
headlines
passing
of
child
child
remains
remains
found
found in abandoned
They spoke of the
orphanage,
light
while
flickering
television
strange
cameras
of
crowded
its
the
rhythm
site.
faltering.
The town,
as though someone
haunted
or
by
something
whispers,
was
now
manipulating
faced
it.
proof.
Some said the
Families
keeper
who had
guided
grown
them
up hearing
deliberately
rumors of
towards the rocks,
disappearances
not
suddenly
away.
realized the
Others
stories were
believed
true.
the sea itself had
Authorities
twisted the
tried to
beam,
contain the
turning
panic.
salvation
Speaking
into
of
a lure.
historic burials,
Whatever the cause,
possible
the wrecks
epidemic
continued.
casualties.
One winter,
But the evidence
3
spoke
ships went
otherwise.
down in a single
The shallow,
storm.
unmarked
Entire
grave beneath
crews
the
were
dormitory.
lost.
The
Was not a
waves
burial
hurled
ground.
timber and corpses
It was a
against
hiding
the
place.
cliffs.
So
As
many
forensic
that the village
teams
worked,
stopped counting.
more discoveries
That night,
emerged. Witnesses
some
swore the
skeletons
lighthouse
bore
beam
marks
never
that
faltered.
suggested
In
malnutrition.
fact, it burned
Stunted
brighter
growth,
than ever,
brittle
too
bones,
bright, as if
malformed
mocking
joints.
the drowned with a
Others
cruel,
carried evidence of
unwavering gaze.
untreated illness.
One fisherman who
tuberculosis
survived
lesions,
claimed that in the
signs of
midst of the
rickets,
storm,
severe
he looked up at
infections
the
that had
lantern
eaten
room
into
and saw
bone.
2 lights.
But more
the great
disturbing
Fresnel
still
were the
lens
fractures
and another
healed
smaller
breaks
globe
in
beside
arms
it,
and ribs,
like a man's
evidence
eyes
of
staring
repeated
down at
trauma
him.
over
The
time.
villagers began
These
to
were
call
not
it
simply
the cursed
children
tower.
who had died
They
of
avoided
sickness or
speaking of
poverty.
it directly.
They were children
referring
who had
instead
suffered.
to the place of
Some
wrecks,
skulls showed
or the
depressions
watchers
that
that
could not have been
families who had
accidental,
lost men to the
suggesting
sea
blows.
whispered that the
One
keeper
skeleton
had struck a
bore the
bargain,
marks of
that he
shackles
offered
still
lives to the
around
waves in
ankles,
exchange for
the
his
iron
own
fused
eternal
into
place
the
in the
bone,
tower,
as though the
mothers
child
told
had
their
been
children
restrained
not
for
to
long
wander the
periods of
cliffs at
time.
night.
The
lest
deeper
the keeper's
investigators
shadow
beckoned them into
the
the
more
surf,
horrifying
even
the picture
supply
became.
crews grew fearful.
Additional hidden
Many
cavities
refused
were
to
found
dock
in
unless the
other parts
weather
of the
was
building.
calm. They
Beneath
claimed
the chapel,
the sea grew
in the
restless
basement,
near the rocks,
and under the east
as if
wing where the
unseen
kitchen
hands
once
stirred
stood.
beneath the surface.
Each time,
on more than one
remains
occasion,
surfaced.
boats
Bones
capsized
wrapped
without
in old
warning.
burlap
Though no
sacks,
storm had
skulls
yet
with
risen.
hair still
Survivors
clinging to them,
told of
small
sudden
currents
currents
dragging
dragging
them
them
tucked
toward
into
the
the
rocks,
dirt,
of
waves
waves
rising
rising
like
an
walls to dash them
rusted
against
tin
stone.
stone.
A child's
Always
locket
when they
with
looked
the
up,
picture of a
they
mother
swore
long
they
gone.
saw him watching.
These items were
His
not
figure
random.
dark against
They
the
were
lantern's glow.
keepsakes,
The
never
last
moving,
belongings
never
of
held
children
in.
who had
The
been
strange
arranged
pattern
pattern
of
of
wrecks
record
could
not be ignored.
The sheer scale of the
Authorities launched
discovery
inquiries,
made explanations
suspecting
impossible.
negligence.
Authorities
Inspectors arrived,
no longer
questioning the keeper.
These were epidemic
Examining the
victims
tower,
quickly
but
buried
every
in
time
haste.
they came,
The records
light
of the
was
orphanage
immaculate.
listed
The
far
glass
fewer
shone,
deaths than
the
the
wick
number
was
of
trimmed,
bodies found.
the records
and many
precise.
names in the
His
ledgers had been
logbooks, though
crossed out
increasingly
without
filled with
explanation.
cryptic passages,
It became clear that
contained
someone,
no evidence
whether
of failure.
caretakers,
Technically,
administrators,
he had
or
fulfilled
both,
his oath,
had deliberately
yet the sea
hidden these
continued
children
to claim
beneath the
lives.
floors,
Some
consigning
officials
them to
blamed
silence
storms
and
and
darkness
fog, or
rather than
faulty
acknowledgement. The
Others
question
began
was
to
no
whisper
longer
in
if
private
the orphanage
that
had
the
been
man had
haunted,
lost his
but
mind,
by whom,
and that his
the
obsession
emotional
with the
weight
light
of the
had crossed
discovery
into
rippled
something
through the
dangerous.
community.
But no matter how many
Descendants of
letters
those
were
who had
written,
once lived
or how
in the
many
orphanage
officials
came
debated,
forward,
the keeper
desperate to know
remained.
if their
The
missing
tower
relatives
functioned,
were among the
and so
dead.
the deaths
Survivors
continued.
of the
Folklore
institution,
took over
by
where
then
facts
elderly,
failed.
broke
The
their
villagers
silence,
said the tower
recounting
itself
the
had
years
become
of
a beacon
abuse,
for death,
neglect,
its
and
stones soaked
disappearances
with the
that they
cries
had
of the
long been
drowned.
too
They
afraid to
believed the
discuss.
keeper no no longer spoke of friends who vanished overnight, that he tended the flames not for sailors' questions, but for spirits lost to the waves. Sounds at night each wreck suggested bodies being each drowned man their testimonies to join his eternal congregation. Fishermen began to report strange sights, carried undeniable weight in the face of the skeletal evidence, vanishing. The most chilling discoveries came not in the remains themselves, only to dissolve but in the strange carvings found on some of the wooden some even claimed to hear bells tolling. Investigators documented crude etchings, entire symbols resembling crosses twisted into unfamiliar shapes, circles intersected by jagged lines. One tale appears to be letters forming words in a language no one immediately recognized, said to have screamed like 1,000 desperate scratchings from the children themselves, carrying dozens of families was prayers carved in their final moments. The villagers stood. Others, however, suspected they were deliberate symbols, watching the doomed vessel crash.
Yet one witness swore that before the impact, he saw the lighthouse flame shift, but no clear explanation then flare again. What was so manipulated? The carving ship struck the rocks made within seconds. The orphanage still stood. Survivors and described to be the keeper on the gallery, even the raising one arm to tell the truth long before the storm will evade. Whether these were illusions of terrified minds or signs of something darker forever, no one could say. It was no longer just became so numerous that frightened children, that the coast was a burial ground, a reputation as haunted. Cruelty. Maps marked the area with even darker. Sailors, paranormal investigators who returned whispering the prayers not just for safe passage and escalation of activity who never left. Once there and yet faint through it all. Now there remained at his post, where once shadows in his routine, now figures acknowledged the rumors across halls. His logbooks continued to record violently. Each batteries drained within so precise several investigators claimed, but woven between the weather reports were lines that revealed the true state of his mind. Seemed to scream, demanded authorities eventually sealed off the orphanage, the light declaring it unsafe to the villagers. These writings were proof not erase what had been to the authorities. The bones of the ramblings of a man louder than any by solitude, louder than the sailors. They were confirmation of what they already believed. The orphanage was no longer a beacon of safety. It had been a lure, and the walls had conspired where the sea claimed what it desired. Guided by discovery was not the last, refused to leave. For once the curse of the tower became legend. Others began to follow. That outlived those who told it, revealed another layer of horror. Storm. Each personal burned on, watched over by the solitary figures who paced the gallery. They were children to this lives. Some say his shadow can still be seen in the glow, dark standing silent as each discovery unfolded. Perhaps the question grew louder, and who will be claimed by the rocks below? The answer:
for every life there is an ending. For every story, a final chapter. Yet for the keeper of the cursed tower, death itself seemed to falter, hesitating at the threshold as though uncertain whether it could truly claim him. The records tell one story, the villagers another, and the sea, always the sea, offers no answer but silence. What remains is a tangle of contradictions, a mystery so dense that even the passing of centuries has failed to unravel it. Officially, his discovery beneath the floors was only the beginning. Once the shock subsided, investigators, historians, and forensic specialists began the slow and methodical process of piecing together what had really happened inside the orphanage. To the authorities, part of the story enough to close the documents. The tower had been on the lingering voices of survivors that began to paint the fuller, darker picture. What emerged was a narrative that was not just about a single institution near the tower, but about deliberate concealment, shadow pacing, about silence woven into the very records meant to preserve truth. They said no body was ever pulled across the sea, no grave was ever filled with his remains. The memories of those who records may have declared him dead. The first step was the forensic examination of the remains. For months after his supposed anthropologists catalogued every bone, the lantern, every scrap of fabric, and unbroken, every object pulled from the earth had been assigned. They found signs that aligned with the survival days were marked by malnourishment, etched into bones that had stopped growing during a brutal storm. Fractures, he was healed improperly, clutching the railing, repeated abuse smashed and untreated illnesses that could have been prevented with even the most basic medical care. In brief, some remains carried stranger marks, head tilted back, scratches as if he were embracing the kind that did not come from animals or soil, but from tools. His logbook ending. These marks suggested restraints, nothing or more. Possibly even others claimed his end was quieter. Official almost hesitated to make such claims. They said he prepared himself for every skeleton, preparing for far more questions than answers. The lens until it the belongings found with the bodies became another haunting layer of reservoir with oil. The wooden doll with one arm missing after tin whistle. Then he climbed to the lantern, faded photograph. Time. These items spoke of individuality. In a place when the supply crew arrived weeks later, they found these were not anonymous children, but the tower people with lives and no trace of him remained. The fact that such objects were buried with them suggested someone, only the steady flame, even another child slowly had tried to preserve their memory. A third version had lingered long in taverns and fishing objects into the earth, something more chilling. No one spoke. According to these accounts, the evidence suggested a systematic effort to bury not just the bodies. He did not vanish, but the truth itself. He simply historians turned to some villages swore they saw him walking the cliffs. What they found was alleged riddled with inconsistencies. Others claimed they heard his footsteps echoing inside the empty tower. Through in heavy one family living on the mainland, the official told of a figure knocking on their door during a storm. Some children's admissions were listed when they opened it, but their departures were never noted. Footprints that others simply vanished from the pages. Their lines abruptly came from sailors. The
Long
pattern
after
was
the tower
undeniable.
was said to be unmanned,
Children had disappeared without explanation,
the light burning
and
bright.
someone had gone
Some
to great
swore they
lengths
saw
to
a
erase
figure
them from
pacing
history.
inside the
The
lantern
deeper
room, silhouetted
investigators
against
dug,
the glow.
the more disturbing the
they
connections
claimed to
became.
hear a voice
Official
carried across
reports
the waves
filed to government
warning them to
officers
steer
during
clear,
the
or in
orphanage's
some
operation,
cases,
urging
painted a
them
picture
toward
of
the
moral
rocks.
hardship.
To these
But
sailors,
nothing
the
unusual
keeper had never left
when
at all.
compared against
He
the
remained in
forensic
the tower,
evidence, bound
and
by his
missing
oath,
names,
deathless
it became
and
clear
tireless,
these
tending a
reports were
flame that no
falsified.
longer needed fuel.
Death rates were
Skeptics,
underreported,
of course,
and
have their
causes of death
explanations.
were vague or
They argue
suspiciously
that the
uniform.
sightings were
Illness,
illusions,
fever,
products of
respiratory
fear
and
and
failure.
fatigue.
These
The sea is a
explanations
master of
did not
trickery,
align with the
bending
number
light,
of bodies
warping
found,
sound,
nor with the
creating
signs of
phantoms out
physical
of mist.
trauma visible
The
on the
automation
remains
of the tower
either
ensured
officials
that the
were
light
complicit,
continued even
or
without a
someone
human
inside
hand,
the orphanage
which
could
could easily
deliberately
explain
hid
the
the
report
truth
to
avoid
avoid
scandal.
scandal.
As
Survivor
for the
testimonies filled in even
perhaps
more of
it
the
was
gaps.
nothing more than
Elderly
shadows
men
thrown
and
by
women,
the rotating
one
lens,
silent children
and yet
in those
the
dormitories
logbooks complicate
began to
matters.
come forward.
After his
Their accounts
supposed
were
death,
chillingly
new entries
consistent.
appeared in the
Many
margins of
remembered
the
the
final
disappearances,
volumes.
entries
The bed
written
left
in the
empty,
same cramped,
the whispers
slanted
of
hand
children,
that villagers
the
swore was
caretakers,
his,
curt
phrases
explanations
like
that someone
the sea
had been
calls
adopted.
again.
But
It
they
is not
also
finished.
remembered the fear
I've
of
asking
asking
too many
Officials
questions.
dismissed these
Punishments
as
were
forgeries,
swift
the
and
work
brutal
of
for those
pranksters
who
or
spoke
later
about the
keepers with a
vanishings.
taste for
Some
melodrama.
survivors
But to
recalled
those who
being
had
told
known
that
the man,
certain
the
children
handwriting
had gone
was
below,
unmistakable,
a phrase they
so
never
what then
understood as
was the
children,
truth?
but which
Did
now
he drown
seemed
in
to
the
point
fury of
toward
the
the
waves
falls
where the
his
remains
body
had been
swallowed by the
discovered?
abyss?
One
Did he
survivor,
walk away from
her
the
voice
tower,
shaking,
lost
described
madness,
how she had
vanishing
woken in
into
the
night,
night,
or
to
did
see
he
two
pass beyond the
caretakers
ordinary
carrying
fate
what
of
looked
men,
like a
his
small
soul
infused
infused
with
with
the
the
stone
stone
and
and
sheet.
flame?
His
They
vigil
moved
eternally,
quietly, no one can
disappearing
say for
toward the
certain
basement.
what is
The next
undeniable is
morning,
this:
the
his
bed
absence
beside
did
hers
not
was
bring
empty.
peace.
Another
The tower
spoke of
remained
being
restless.
locked in a
The
storage
villagers
closet as
continued to
punishment,
report
only
strange
to hear
lights,
muffled
strange
cries
sounds,
beneath the
strange
floorboards.
shadows.
She
Sailors
pounded the
still
walls,
swore the beam
desperate
shifted
to
in
help,
unnatural
but no
ways,
one came.
and always
These
in the
memories
corner
once
of their
dismissed
vision,
as
there seemed
nightmares
to be
or
exaggerations.
the gallery,
Were now
as though the
validated
keeper
by
was
the
still there,
evidence unearthed
still
in the
refusing
dirt.
to leave.
Even more
Death
damning
claimed
were the
his name in
documents
the
found
records,
hidden in the
but the
town's
sea had not
municipal
released him.
archives.
His
Letters,
story did not
receipts,
end
and
with a
reports
grave
that
or a
hinted at
funeral.
darker
It
practices.
lingered,
Some
unresolved,
reference
like
to
a medical
storm that never
examinations
passes,
conducted
like a
without
flame that
detail,
refuses to
while
die.
others spoke
The
of
keeper's
special
death,
cases
or
that
the
required
absence of it,
discretion.
only
A few
deepened the legend.
contained vague but
He had
chilling
defied the
phrases
living
like the
world,
less said,
and
the
perhaps
better.
he had defied
Though
death
the language
itself,
was
and so
deliberately
the question
ambiguous,
remains:
when
did the
placed
keeper
against
ever
the
die
backdrop
at
of the
all?
skeletons,
Or is he
these
still
fragments
there,
became
pacing
his
his
endless
endless
circle.
The
waiting for
orphanage
the
had
next
not
ship
simply
to
been
pass,
negligent.
the next storm
It had
to
been
rise,
hiding
the
something
next
still
soul
to
to
join him in the
something
tower by the
orchestrated.
edge of the world. Folklore too
If
gained
death
a
had truly
disturbing
taken
new
the keeper,
credibility.
then the tower
For
never
decades,
received the message.
townspeople had
For
spoken
those
of
who
hearing
ventured
cries
near
at
in the
night,
years that
of
followed,
seeing
it
figures
was as
in
if
the
the
windows,
lighthouse
of
itself
strange
still
sounds
believed him
rising
alive.
from beneath
The
the
lantern
floors.
continued to glow
Skeptics
when
had
no
dismissed
hand was
these as
present to light it.
superstition, but the
Shadows
discovery
flickered
of
in
the
windows
bodies
where no
revealed that
flame
the
should
folklore
burn.
had been
And
rooted
most
in
chilling
fact.
of all were the
The
reports
cries
of a
had been
figure
real,
moving in the
the
lantern room,
vanishings true.
pacing the gallery
Even the
as though
carvings on
carrying
the
out a
beams,
duty he could
once
never
considered
abandon.
strange
The
graffiti,
earliest accounts
began
came
to
from
take on a
sailors.
chilling weight.
These men,
Were they
hardened by
desperate
salt and
marks from
storm,
children,
were not
or
easily
symbols
rattled.
left by
Yet
caretakers
time and
hiding
again
their
their
deeds?
testimonies carried the
Paranormal
same unease.
researchers insisted
In
that
fog,
the energy
when
of
visibility
so much
narrowed to a
had left
whisper
an
of light,
imprint on the
they
building
claimed the
itself,
beam sometimes
creating the
split,
phenomena
one
that
ray steady,
generations of
the other
townspeople had
faltering,
witnessed.
like the work of
As
two
the
hands guiding the
investigation
lens.
continued,
Some
patterns
swore they
began
saw
to
a man
emerge.
framed in the glow,
Certain years
standing
showed
still
spikes in
and
vanishings,
staring outward,
correlating
though
with
the tower had
financial
long since
downturns
been
or
declared
outbreaks of
unmanned.
disease.
One
Some
captain,
suggested
a
that the
skeptic to the
orphanage,
core, later
overwhelmed
wrote
and
of a night when
underfunded,
he passed
had
dangerously
chosen to
close to
dispose
the
of
rocks.
children
Through
rather
his
than allow their
spyglass,
deaths to
he
be
caught a
recorded
clear view of
officially.
the gallery.
Others whispered
There,
of dark
illuminated by
motives,
lightning,
that the
stood a figure with his back to the sea, facing the lantern. His arms moved in precise motion, as though trimming a wick or adjusting the lens. The captain dismissed it at first as a hallucination, until his first mate, watching through his own glass, asked in a trembling voice, "Why is the man inside the light and not outside it?" The villagers too were not spared. Some reported that on stormy nights the tower seemed to breathe, and its windows flashed with a glow, even when the lantern was known to be extinguished. Children swore they saw a man walking the cliffs, his silhouette swallowed by fog. A few even claimed he knocked on their doors during gales, asking in a hollow voice for oil to keep the lamp alive. Yet when they opened their doors, there was no one, only wet footprints fading into nothing. Ghost stories grew around these sightings. One tale told of fishermen caught in a sudden squall, They
The
rowed
larger question
desperately,
remained,
guided
who
by the lighthouse
orchestrated this
beam.
concealment
Just
and
when
why?
they thought they would be
Was it an
dashed
act
upon
of
the rocks,
desperation by
a voice
staff,
carried
or
across the
something
storm,
more organized,
pull
more
left, pull
intentional?
left now.
The truth
They
remained
obeyed
elusive,
instinctively,
as though the
and
building
found
itself was
themselves
still
in calmer
guarding the
waters,
final
safe.
answers.
When
But
they
one
looked up
fact
to the
was
gallery
certain,
to give thanks,
the orphanage was
they saw
guilty.
a man standing
Its
with one
silence had
hand
been
raised,
broken,
but
its
his
floors
features
no
were
longer
hidden in
able to
shadow.
hold the weight of
And
its
when they
lies.
returned to the village
evidence
to ask
echoed
about
across
him,
decades,
they were told no
reverberating
keeper
in
had served
bones,
there for years.
documents, and
Another
memories.
story, and
With
darker
each echo
still,
came a
spoke
deeper
of a
chill,
shipwreck
a
survivor
sense
washed
that the story
ashore.
was far
He
from
claimed
over,
that as the
that
vessel
something
broke
remained
apart,
hidden
he
still,
saw the
waiting
light
in the
vanish.
shadows.
In the
Daring
chaos,
investigators
he
to look
glimpsed a
closer.
figure in the lantern
For
room.
every life,
But
instead
instead
of
of
tending
tending
the lamp,
for every story,
was
a
turning
final
away,
chapter. Yet
shielding
for the
the
keeper
beam
of
with
the
his
cursed
body.
tower,
The survivor
death itself
swore the
seemed to
figure
falter,
looked directly at
hesitating
him
at the
before the
threshold
waves
as though
pulled him
uncertain
under.
whether it could
Though he
truly
lived
claim
to
him.
tell the tale,
The records tell
the rest
one
of his
story,
crew
the
did not.
villagers another,
To him,
and the sea,
the keeper's
always the
ghost
sea,
was not a
offers
savior,
no answer but
a
silence.
saboteur.
What
By
remains
the
is a
early
tangle of
20th
contradictions, a
stories
mystery
of the
so
phantom
dense
had
that even
become
the
so
passing of
persistent
centuries has
that
failed to
paranormal
unravel it.
investigators
Officially,
began to take
his
notice.
death was noted in
Mediums,
sparse and clinical
thrill
language,
seekers,
and
deceased
later
ghost
cause
hunters
unknown.
made their way to the
Body
cliffs,
unrecovered.
drawn by the legend
That
of
was
the
all.
man who never
A
left.
line in a government
Many
ledger,
brought with them
filed away
recording
with other
devices,
names, other
cameras or
lives,
instruments
other
to measure
forgotten men.
changes in
To
temperature
the
and
authorities,
sound.
it was
What they
enough to
captured
close the
remains
matter.
controversial,
The tower had
but
been
chilling
automated soon
nonetheless.
after. One
Its
group
light
reported
tended by
hearing
mechanisms
rhythmic rather than
footsteps
men.
on the spiral
The
staircase.
keeper was gone,
though no one
case
else was in the
closed.
tower.
But those
The
who lived
sounds
near the
ascended
tower,
slowly,
those who
paused,
watched his shadow
then
pacing
descended
year
again.
after year,
When they
knew
followed,
better, or
they
at
found
least
nothing
believed
but
they
the
did.
echo of their
They
own
said
breath.
no body was ever
Another
pulled from
team
the
set
sea,
up
no
cameras in the
grave was
lantern
ever
room.
filled with his
On
remains.
playback,
The
a
records
faint
may have
figure
declared
appeared
him
in the
dead,
glass
but the
reflection,
cliffs
thin,
and waves
stooped,
told a different
hands
story.
clasped
For
behind
nights
his back
after
as
his
he
supposed
posed in
death,
endless
the
circles.
villagers still saw
The
the
image
lantern
dissolved
burning,
into static
steady and
within
unbroken,
seconds,
even
leaving
though no
only
one
the
had
empty
been
lens.
assigned to tend it. But perhaps
Some
the most
claimed his
terrifying
final
days
days
were marked
from
by
those who
violence.
stayed overnight.
One tale,
One
insists
investigator
that during a
described
brutal
waking to
storm,
the sound
he
of
was seen
scratching
on the
at his
gallery,
door,
clutching
as
the
though
railing,
fingernails
as waves
raked against
smashed
the wood.
against the rocks
Another
below.
swore the
Lightning
entire
struck
tower
via the
vibrated
tower,
in the middle
illuminating
of the night,
him
as
in
if
brief
something
flashes,
massive pounded
arms
on
spread
its
wide
walls
from
the
head tilted
outside.
back,
And
as if he
nearly
were
all of them
embracing the
reported
storm.
the same detail.
When dawn came,
the smell
he
of
was
oil,
gone,
sharp
his
and
logbook
acrid,
ending
lingering in
mid-sentence.
the air.
The sea,
Even when the
nothing more.
lantern had not been
Others
lit in
claimed his
decades.
end was quieter,
Skeptics,
almost
of course,
ritualistic.
dismissed these
They
encounters
said
as
he prepared
superstition,
himself for death like a
illusions
monk
born of
preparing
fear
for
and
prayer.
expectation.
He polished the
They
lens
argued
until
that the
it
mind,
gleamed
when
like
primed
crystal.
with stories of
He trimmed
ghosts,
the wick and
filled
filled
the
shadows
reservoir
well with
none
oil,
exist.
ensuring
The
the
sea,
light would burn
with its
long
shifting
after
lights
he was
and eerie
gone.
sounds,
Then he
provides
climbed to
fertile
the
ground
lantern
for
room one
hallucination.
final time,
Yet
lit
the
the flame,
consistency
and
of the
sat in
reports
silence.
gave even doubters
When the
pause.
supply crew
Too
arrived
many
weeks
people
later,
described the
they
same
found the
figure,
light still
the
glowing,
same pacing
but the tower
steps,
empty.
the same
No
hollow
trace
presence.
of him remained.
The villagers
no coat,
themselves
no
avoided
boots,
the tower
no body,
whenever possible.
only the steady
To
flame,
them,
turning
it was not a
slowly as though he
curiosity
was
to
still
be
there.
studied,
A
but
third
a reality
version,
to be
whispered in
endured.
taverns and
They knew
fishing
better
huts,
than to mock the
suggests
stories,
something more
for
chilling.
they had grown up
According
with
to
the
these
sound of
accounts,
storms
his
rattling
death
their
never
windows,
happened at all,
and the sight
he
of
did
the
not
lantern
drown.
burning when it
He
should
did
not
not vanish.
Some
He
said the
simply
keeper's ghost was
continued.
harmless.
Some
Protecting
villagers swore they
sailors as
saw
he
him
had in
walking
life.
the cliffs
Others
years after his
insisted he
death had been
grown bitter,
recorded.
vengeful,
Others claimed they
guiding
heard his
ships to
footsteps
ruin as
echoing
penance for
inside
his
the empty
refusal to
tower.
leave.
One
What
family,
united all
living
the
on the
tales was
mainland,
this:
told of a
the
figure
lantern
knocking
room
on
was
their
never
door
empty,
during a storm,
whether
only
seen
to
through a
disappear when
spyglass,
they opened it,
glimpsed in
leaving
lightning,
behind wet
or
footprints
captured in
that
the
led
corners of
nowhere.
photographs.
Perhaps the most
figure
unsettling
remained.
stories
He
came
paced
from
the
sailors.
gallery.
Long after
He
the
watched
tower
the
was
sea.
said to be
He
unmanned,
tended a flame
ships
that should no
reported
longer
seeing the light
exist.
burning bright.
To this day,
Some
those
swore
who
they
pass
saw a
the
figure
coast speak
pacing
of the
inside
light
the
as more
lantern
than a
room,
beacon.
silhouetted
It is a
against the
haunting,
glow.
a
In
presence
fog,
that
they
refuses
claimed to
hear a voice carried across the waves, may be warning them to steer clear, or in some cases urging them toward the shadow endures. To these sailors, the keeper had never left the lantern room. He remained his eternal prison, bound by his oath, deathless and tireless, and as long as the flame that no longer needed persists. Skeptics, of course, have their explanations. Safety. They argue that the sightings were illusions, keeping the products of fear and fatigue. A lighthouse is a master of trickery, of salvation light. It stands as the last creating phantoms out of mist across an endless automation of the tower ensured that the light curtain never left. Even without his tower became something which could easily explain the reports of its persistence of marble. As for the figure in the lantern room,
Perhaps it was nothing more than shadows thrown by the rotating lens walls, and yet the villagers came to see the tower not as a beacon of life, after his supposed a shrine to death. New entries appeared in the margins of the final volumes, generations with wrecks the same cramped slanted hand that villagers swore was his shattered hull, phrases like the sea calls again, sailors whispered that the sea had claimed more lives there than any officials dismissed these as forgeries, the work of the pranksters or later keepers heard a taste for melodrama rising above the roar. But to those who had known the man, the handwriting was unmistakable. And above it all, then, the lighthouse was the true silent. Did he drown in the fury of the waves? His body swallowed by the abyss. Did he walk away from the tower, lost to madness, vanishing into fog? Or did he pass beyond the ordinary fate of men, filled his soul fused with the stone and flame like his vigil eternal? His body no one can say for certain, but his soul what is undeniable is this stone. His absence villagers spoke of him as if he had already passed. The tower remained restless, referring to the villagers continued to report strange shadow at the tower. Sounds. It was as though shadows died long before his physical being shifted in unnatural ways, and always in the corner of their vision there seemed to be a figure pacing the gallery, sailors as though the keeper was still there, still refusing to leave. Whisper prayers death had claimed his name in the records, but the sea had not released him. His story did not end with a grave or a funeral. There is no soil unresolved, like a storm that never passes, like a flame devoured by the dark, to die. Final the keeper's death unknown, or the absence of such a world. Only Lighthouse the legend more than a guide. He had defied the living world, and perhaps he had defied death itself. And so the question: where else might they did the keeper ever die that promised salvation, or is he still there, pacing his endless circle, waiting for the next ship to pass, the next storm to rise, held the weight of every life to join him in the tower by the edge of the world? The skeletons beneath the floors revealed the victims, but to understand the full horror of the orphanage, investigators and historians had to turn their gaze toward those who ran it, the caretakers, the staff, and the administrators who were meant to protect the children. For decades, these figures were remembered in vague tones, strict, stern, often cruel, but rarely named or described in detail. When the walls finally gave up their secrets, a far more disturbing portrait began to emerge. The caretakers were not merely disciplinarians bound by the cold practices of their era. Some were complicit, others malicious, and a few appeared to harbor secrets so disturbing that even their colleagues chose silence over confrontation. To tell the story of the orphanage is to peel back the layers of their complicity and to confront the possibility that the building was not simply a place of neglect, but of deliberate cruelty. The head administrators, often cloaked in religious or civic respectability, were the first layer of this veil. They presented themselves to the public as saints of charity, smiling in photographs, speaking of duty and morality, but their ledgers told a different story. Names crossed out, deaths underreported, donations redirected. Some seemed to treat the orphanage less as a sanctuary and more as a business, siphoning resources for personal use. While the children starved, records of funds sent for food and medicine rarely matched the supplies actually purchased. Testimonies from survivors confirmed that the children were often left hungry, while administrators dined in comfort. The contradiction was glaring: piety in public, corruption in private. Beneath the administrators were the caretakers who enforced the orphanage's daily discipline. Here, the line between indifference and cruelty blurred. Some were likely overwhelmed, trapped in a system that valued obedience above compassion, but others seemed to relish the power they held over vulnerable children. Survivors recalled caretakers who carried long canes, striking for the smallest infractions, spilled water, whispered words, or even the simple act of crying. One survivor remembered a caretaker who forced children to kneel on salt for hours as punishment, their skin rubbed raw. Another recalled being dragged down into the basement and locked in darkness for an entire night, left with nothing but the sound of faint scratching beneath the floors. The cruelty was not just punishment, it was humiliation, a stripping away of humanity. And yet, what disturbed investigators most was the growing body of evidence that not all the staff's actions could be explained by harsh discipline alone. Testimonies spoke of certain caretakers who took children away at night, returning without them. Rumors hinted that these individuals operated with knowledge and approval from the top. Survivors recalled whispers among staff, special cases, quiet removals, phrases that aligned with the gaps in the orphanage's ledgers, and the skeletons discovered
in shallow graves. Whether these caretakers were acting out of desperation, cruelty, or under the orders of others, one fact was certain: Lighthouse they had been instrumental in the disappearances. The basement, always the subject of fear, seemed to be the locus of these secrets. Survivors recalled caretakers leading children down into its depths with no explanation. Some children returned days later, though pale and silent, unwilling to speak of what had happened. Others never returned at all. Forensic evidence later confirmed that many of the bones found beneath the orphanage showed signs of trauma consistent with confinement and restraint. The shackles fused into one child's ankles suggested deliberate imprisonment. Whether the basement had been used for punishment, medical experiments, or something even darker, the caretakers had been the ones who enforced its terrors. Rumors of ritualistic behavior added another disturbing dimension. The carvings found beneath the floors, symbols that did not match any obvious religious tradition, raised questions that investigators could not fully answer. Survivors remembered caretakers muttering prayers not heard in chapel services, and some on the other side forced to recite strange phrases while kneeling in darkness. Were these the desperate inventions of frightened children, or were the caretakers themselves engaged in something occult, something hidden beneath the mask of religion? Historians could not agree, but the consistency of these accounts and the presence of the carved symbols suggested that the orphanage had harbored with practices that went far beyond maritime archives. Even among the staff, there were divisions. Some seemed uneasy, leaving their posts without explanation, abandoning the building overnight. Others remained silent and complicit, about their eyes downcast when children disappeared. This silence may have been born from fear of the administrators, fear of exposure, fear of something darker within the walls. But silence was complicity, and every staff member who turned away allowed the orphanage's horrors to continue. Their secrets became part of the fabric of the building, but woven into every scream and every vanished name. His official Perhaps the most haunting accounts came from the staff members. Nobody recovered fragments of their guilt. One caretaker decades later admitted the Lighthouse had been punished in ways that should never have been allowed. Another hinted that some deaths had been covered up to protect the institution, but none admitted the full scope. None confessed to the hidden graves. Long after their partial admissions, stories that contradict the much finality of the ledger, locked away by shame and fear. The caretakers had carried their secrets to their graves, to the villagers, leaving only fragments for history to piece together. For the town, speak of the revelation of the staff's complicity was devastating. Many of these caretakers had been respected citizens. Their cruelty hidden behind closed doors. Families who once trusted the institution with their children now realized the trust had been betrayed in the most unforgivable way. The administrators who had preached morality had instead orchestrated neglect, abuse, and perhaps even ritualistic imagination. The caretakers who should have nurtured the instead inflicted contradictions. The building had not been reported by accident. It had been poisoned by the very people meant to protect the innocent. No trace as the investigation unfolded, the staff of the orphanage became spectral figures. Their faces blurred by time, but their deeds etched into the bones beneath the floors. The question of motive remained unanswered. Were they driven by desperation, by cruelty, by belief in some twisted ritual, or by simple indifference? Each possibility was horrifying in its own right. What was certain, however, was that the orphanage's darkest secrets were inseparable from the hands that ran it. The caretakers were not just overseers of a failed institution. They were gatekeepers of horror, and their silence ensured that the voices of the children would echo long after their bodies were hidden in the earth. The true measure of their guilt may never be fully known. But in the chill of the orphanage's halls, in the strange symbols carved into its beams, and in the shallow graves beneath its floors, their secrets continue to whisper, and those whispers suggest that the story of the caretakers was not simply one of cruelty, but of something far more deliberate. Scholars who have studied the legend of sanctuary into isolation, dread, grief, and children into shadows trapped between a graveyard and sailors. When the first bones were carried out of the orphanage, the atmosphere of the building was easier to believe. Paranormal researchers often speak of places where tragedy lingers like a scar, but in this case the scar seemed to rip wide open. Before the discovery, the orphanage had been a site of faint phenomena, strange whispers and cold drafts, shadows that flitted past the edge of the madness of men. But after the floors gave up their secrets, yet others argue that it was as if the dead, now exposed,
no longer had to remain
Researchers
silent.
point to the
The
consistency
orphanage's
of
haunting
sightings.
escalated
The figure
into a
in the
surge of
lantern
activity
room
so
was
intense
pacing,
that
the
even
unseasoned
broken
beam.
investigators were
These
shaken.
details
The
recur
voices
across
grew louder.
decades,
The
told by
shadows bolder,
sailors from
and the
different
presence
countries.
within the walls
Villagers
seemed
of
no
different
longer content
generations,
to remain passive.
investigators of
It was
different
as though
eras.
the building
How
itself
could
had
so many
awakened.
separate accounts
The earliest
describe the
reports
same
after the
image if it were
discovery
all
came from the
invention?
forensic teams.
Perhaps the keeper
Police
truly
officers,
did linger,
construction
not
workers
in
and
flesh, but in
scientists,
some
men
spectral
and women
form
trained
bound
to
to
dismiss
dismiss
superstition.
There is also the
found
question of the
themselves
light
unnerved
itself.
by what they
Official
encountered.
records
Some
state that
described
after
hearing
automation,
small
the
footsteps in the
lantern was
halls,
controlled
even
by
though they were
machinery.
alone.
Yet
Others
multiple
reported
witnesses
sudden
swore
drops in
that its
temperature,
behavior remained
so sharp
uncanny.
that their breath
It
misted in
flickered
the
when
air
no
despite
storm
the
was
summer
present.
heat.
Tools
It burned
looked
too
placed,
brightly in
lights
fog,
failed,
as if
and at
pushing
least
against
one
the
officer
very
swore
mist.
he heard a
It
child's
dimmed
voice
at
calling
moments
his
when
name
ships
from
approached,
beneath the
only
floorboards.
to flare again
These
after they
accounts
struck
initially
the
kept
rocks.
quiet to avoid
Mechanisms
ridicule.
can malfunction,
Began
yes,
to leak as
but the
more and more
timing
witnesses
seemed almost
experienced
intentional.
them.
The
Was it the
haunting
fault
was no
of aging
longer
equipment,
confined to
or
folklore.
the unseen
It
hand
was
of the
intruding
keeper
into
still
official
telling his
investigations. What
Paranormal
makes the legend
researchers
so
descended
enduring
on
is
the
not
sight
whether
and
the
waves
facts
supported,
drawn by the
but how the
combination of
facts failed to
confirmed
fully
history and
dismiss it.
unexplained phenomena.
Bureaucracy offers
They brought
only
cameras,
silence where the
recording
villagers
devices and
demanded
electromagnetic
answers.
sensors,
Logbooks tell of
eager to
storms but
capture
not of
evidence.
voices.
What they found was
Newspapers
unlike anything they had
themselves.
documented
Oral
before.
traditions
In the
exaggerate,
chapel, digital
but they
recorders
preserve
picked up
something
hints
official
sung
history
softly by
cannot.
unseen
The raw
voices.
fear of
In the
those who lived
dormitories,
in the shadow of the
investigators
tower.
captured the sound
The
of
truth
children
perhaps
crying,
lies somewhere
followed
in
by
between.
faint whispers that
Maybe
seemed
he
to
was
say,
a man who
"We're still
refused to
here."
surrender his
In
post,
one of the most
whose
chilling
obsession
recordings,
became the
a
seed
voice,
of myth.
small,
Maybe
raspy,
he
and
did die
undeniably
quietly in
human,
a storm
was
or
heard
from
asking,
exhaustion.
"Why did
And
the rest
truth was
save us?"
shaped by grief
Even
and
skeptics
imagination.
could not easily
Or maybe
dismiss
just
such
maybe
direct
the
words,
villagers were
especially
right.
when they were captured.
Maybe the
Repeated
seed claimed
claims
him, but the tower
devices,
refused
the
to let him
shadows
go.
that moved through
For
the
those
halls
who
also
passed the
became
coast
more
today,
aggressive.
fact and
Visitors
folklore
reported
blurred
seeing
seamlessly.
child-sized
The lighthouse
figures dancing from
abandoned,
doorway to
its
doorway,
staircases
their
crumbling,
movements too
its
fast and
lantern
precise to
automated.
be tricks of
Yet
light.
visitors swear
Some
they feel
investigators
watched,
described
that the air
seeing
carries
these figures
whispers,
up close,
that shadows
pale
shift
faces
just
with
beyond
hollow
sight.
eyes, staring
Tourists
silently
read
before
plaques that
vanishing
recount
into
the
the
official
darkness.
story.
In
For
the
the
basement
locals
where the
tell
lost
most
remains
remains
has been
uncovered
uncovered,
about the keeper.
these apparitions
They do
were
not
often
speak his
accompanied
name
by
easily,
violent physical
as though afraid he
sensations.
might hear.
Investigators
In the end,
spoke of
the
sudden
question is
nausea,
not which version
pounding
is true,
headaches,
but why
and
the
the
legend
overwhelming
persists.
feeling of being
Perhaps
suffocated.
it is because the
One
story
researcher
touches
collapsed
something
entirely,
fundamental,
gasping
fear
for
of
air
being
as though
forgotten,
invisible
the
hands were
terror of
pressing down on
isolation,
his chest.
the seduction
He had
of
to be
obsession,
carried from
the
the building,
keeper who never
and
left,
afterward he
embodies the
refused to
possibility
return.
that devotion can
Objects too
outlive
began
death,
to move
that
on their
duty
own.
can imprison the
Chairs
soul,
scraped across
that
the
even in a
floor where
world
no
of
one
facts
was
and
near them.
records, some
Doors
truths remain
slammed violently,
untouchable,
shaking the
preserved
walls.
in whispers
In one
carried by the
infamous
sea.
incident, a
And so
crucifix
the
that had
lighthouse
hung in the
endures,
chapel for
half in
decades fell
history,
suddenly
half in
from the
legend.
walls, snapping
Its
in two on
stones
the
hold the
stone
weight
floor.
of facts.
The timing
Its
was
shadows
uncanny.
hold the breath
The
of
moment it
folklore,
fell
and in the
coincided
lantern
with an
room where a
EVP
light still
recording
burns,
in which a
sailors
child's
swear
voice
they see
clearly
a figure
said,
pacing,
"No prayers."
blurring the line
For many,
between
this
what
moment
was and
became
what
the
still
defining
may be.
image of the
Time
orphanage's
is a
haunting,
merciless
a
tide,
rejection of the
empires
faith that had
collapse,
once been
ships
used
rot
as a
into
weapon
sand,
against the
and
children
even the
inside.
strongest towers are
Perhaps
worn
the
thin
most
by
disturbing
certain
reports
storms.
came from
Yet the
those who
lighthouse
stayed
at the
overnight.
edge of the world still
Paranormal
stands.
teams that
Its
attempted
weather-beaten
extended
stones
investigations
attached to
found
stubborn
themselves
endurance,
subjected to
though its
relentless
lantern has
activity.
long been
Some
automated.
woke to find
The
the structure
small
remains
handprints
intact,
smeared across their
its
equipment,
windows staring
even though
blankly
no
out to
children
sea
were
like the
present.
sockets of a skull.
Others describe
It is
the
no longer a
sensation
place of
blankets
duty,
being pulled
but of
from their
legend.
bodies as they
Still,
slept.
those who approach
One
it
team
say the
reported
keeper never
hearing a
left,
chorus of
that even
children's
now the
voices
tower
surrounding
watches.
them in the dark,
Modern visitors
growing
describe
louder
the
and
place
louder
with
until
unease.
they broke
To
into
reach
screams.
it, one must
When
brave
the
a treacherous
investigators
path
fled
across
they
jagged
discovered
cliffs,
deep
where
scratches
winds
across
howl
the
and
walls of
gulls
the
scream
room they had
overhead.
occupied.
The closer one
Scratches
comes,
that had not
the
been there
heavier
the night
the air
before.
feels,
The
as if the
escalation
tower
of
itself
phenomena was
exerts a
not
pressure
limited to the
of gravity
investigators.
of sorrow.
Locals living
Photographs
near
show
the
a building
orphanage
in
began
decay,
to experience
rusted
disturbances,
railings
houses as well.
Cracked glass,
Residents
stone
reported
walls
hearing
stained
crying
black
outside
by
their windows at night.
Yet no matter how ruined the
empty.
structure
Some
appears,
claimed they
the
saw
lantern
pale figures in
continues
their
its slow
homes,
rotation,
standing at the foot
sweeping
of their
its beam
children's
across
beds.
the water like
A
an
family
unblinking
living
eye.
less than a mile
Tourists,
away insisted
drawn
that
by
their daughter
morbid
had begun
curiosity,
speaking to an
speak of
imaginary
sensations
friend who
difficult
told her
to
she
explain.
came from under the
Some
floor.
reports
The
girls'
girls'
drawings
as they
climbed
later
the
shown to
spiral
investigators,
staircases, their breath
depicted the
frosting
orphanage
even
in
on mild
startling
days.
detail, despite
Others
the
swear
fact
they
that she
hear
had never
footsteps
been
above
there.
them,
For
steady and
skeptics, the
deliberate,
haunting
pacing
surge was
in
a
rhythm with their
psychological
own.
reaction to
A
the
few
discovery
live in
of the
panic,
bones, grief
claiming
and
to
horror
hear whispered
manifesting as
words
ghost
carried on the
stories.
wind,
But for those who experienced it, there was no doubt that something had changed in the orphanage after its secrets were unearthed. Ghost hunters have made the site a pilgrimage, argued that the act of disturbing the graves recorders and electromagnetic meters, giving them energy for proof of the keeper's eternal vigil. Others many emerged with unsettling evidence. The orphanage was not just haunted by children, but by something darker, like something that had fed on their suffering and now lashed out at anyone who went distant knocks. The strange carvings beneath the floors, echoing from the stairwell, rumors of rituals recorded a voice saying turn the possibility that the command was not only a site of faint but a vessel for something malevolent. The most famous photograph the haunting published online and debated endlessly shows a translucent figure reflected in the lantern glass, silent except for the groan of hands clasped behind its back. In the posture activity erupted in violent bursts. Skeptics argue these are illusions, screaming objects of wind and light amplified by expectation. They point out that the power of suggestion is strong from unseen attacks. Enter a place steeped in the energy stories, intelligent and reactive as though it's whether they are there or not. But even skeptics admit the tower feels different. Those who entered with journalism prided himself on debunking local experiences, spent a night inside as a test, determined to prove later that he had never felt such oppressive silence, as though the air itself resisted his presence. He left before strange lights glowing from the windows that while he did not like lanterns or candles, he believed in that lighthouse's power to break the human spirit. Chapel faint hymns still avoid voices to the older generation that refuses to speak of the keeper directly, beyond referring to him only as the watcher from across the country. Give the rocks life shaken, some muttered in prayers as they sailed past what they had seen. Children dare one another to climb the cliffs and touch the lighthouse door, reinforcing rarely does anyone stay long. As one of those who lingered say they feel their names whispered back to them on the wind, surge as if the tower recognizes each intruder and adds them to a legend had been only in secrets for decades. The reputation of the lighthouse was spread far beyond the village. Stay quiet. Documentaries feature it in countdowns of haunted places, screaming in paranormal forums discuss it with red shadows burned and travel blogs warn thrill seekers to enter at their own risk. The evidence some call it a maritime Pompeii was frozen in time. The orphanage was no longer just not ash but despair. Others call it a liminal place, where the boundary between the living and the dead thins until one is indistinguishable from the other. There was always now the same realization. Coast this was not a haunting born of imagination or the light sometimes falters, dimming for seconds before flaring with unnatural brightness. Radar equipment has been known to fail near the rock floors. Some crews insist they hear bells tolling faintly over the water. The message was clear. The orphanage's story was and always there are the sightings. The story of the orphanage could have ended with the discovery of bones never still. The testimonies of survivors come not from surge of paranormal activity that followed, but from working sailors. What unfolded afterward proved that the building itself carried something more than memory alive. It carried a curse from deck to deck. It was not only the children's voices that haunted those who entered. It was an inexplicable chain of misfortune become a place to follow anyone who dared to disturb loved ones, investigate or profit from the place. Offerings. The curse of the orphanage was not legend alone. Sealed in revealed itself in treated as both tragedies, cemetery, and lives torn apart by the lost. No one hear their names spoken. The first signs came in the wake of the official investigations. They police officers who had handled the remains reported sudden illness. The drowned appeared strange fevers that doctors could not identify. That never forensic technician involved in cataloguing the bones was killed in a car accident of souls guiding their loved ones in the dark. Another darker interpretation basis documenting carvings later confessed to friends that he felt that he resents the automation of his lantern as though something had followed for offerings of oil. He grew increasingly paranoid. Some believe he unable to sleep until he left his job in nearby waters. His family claimed he was never the same. There are stories of these incidents couldn't be coincidence. Their belongings but as they accumulated, their bodies never whispers of a curse began to spread that the contractors hired to secure the buildings to the congregation trapped several workers were injured in accidents that defied explanation. Scaffolding collapsing red calm with the tower today is more than stone malfunctioning and causing severe injury. A story ladders slipping even on stable ground. It is visited by one worker fell through a rotted section of the floor and revered by those who sense in it. He felt hands push him from behind. To step inside he survived but left with broken ribs and the conviction that something in the orphanage wanted him with echoes. After a string of injuries with invisible construction company pulled out entirely mechanical, refusing to take further contracts related to the sense of being watched. They described it travelers describe it with the building doesn't want to be fixed. The moment you look up those who tried to turn the orphanage into profit were only a shadow. At least two groups of investors attempted to purchase the land with his vow of converting it into apartments or tourist attractions, and the tower remains ventures collapsed before never closes on the edge of the world. In one case, financial backers does not remember after a series of inexplicable legal setbacks, carrying them into its endless depths and sudden bankruptcies among key partners. A broken mast. In another, the lead investor died of a widow's cry carried on the wind, collapsing in what some stories defy the sea's hunger. His last words overheard by a colleague to the shore like seaweed, refusing to wash away. After the tale of the lighthouse keeper who never left is one such story, seemed to a legend that has become as immortal as the waves themselves. Visitors often reported that their lives changed when the horizon inside red into black, and you will understand why his vigil endures. Broke down. The tower rises against the dying light. Its stone-scarred one paranormal investigator described how her marriage collapsed within months of her visit, and then the lantern by a series of financial disasters across the waters. Another team turning footage went viral online. It is later disbanded after 2 members' satellites and radar have replaced it. They claimed that it consists of the orphanage, a remnant of another recurring nightmares. Some say this is standing silently at their bedside. Others whisper it is some investigators still that objects from the orphanage. Legends always ask questions of those who listen. Even photographs. This one asks perhaps the most for the curse. When does duty end home off, and when does obsession begin? Like activity until the items were returned. As all men of his local families who had once promised to keep the flame alive, to speak of accidents that seemed tied to save lives. For children who was a burden carried for a time with scratches across their arms, but for him they had been grabbed by invisible hands. It bound him not just to the lantern, found unconscious at the gates after daring until his friends to step inside. Unfastened the links. Doctors found was it devotion, his collapse, or was it madness? But he remained mute. Did he remain out of love for the blankly as though because he could no longer remember how to live without his family? Perhaps that is what makes his tale so unsettling. Adults too reported uncanny experiences, sudden losses of consciousness near them. The danger of devotion, pale faces staring from the upper windows, and overwhelming of a man who gave himself so fully to his work. Historians began to speculate that the curse was not the lighthouse, paranormal, and the lighthouse became but the result of layered together trauma. They remained. The orphanage had absorbed decades of suffering without rest, cruelty, and for death. Sailors, the legend is a reminder of the thin line between salvation and destruction. Such concentrated agony, they argue, could create a psychic weight so immense that it bound itself to the building coast, radiating out whether to affect anyone who guides or condemns them. Paranormal researchers went further, suggesting that the strange carvings found beneath the floor on the horizon is the light for you, perhaps or against you. Bind spirits. For villagers, the story is a warning whispered to children. Then the orphanage was not merely to the sea. It was bound by yourself wholly to the storm, created by human hands and fed by human suffering. They speak of the keeper folklore surrounding the curse grew darker with each retelling. Locals began to say to them he is a lesson what it was. There are promises that must not be kept too long to cite devotion, face sudden tragedies, car accidents, who seek the paranormal, even suicide. His legend is a beacon in teenagers who vandalized the chapel with spray paint and were later involved in a fatal crash to glimpse their families, to hear his footsteps, none of them had been to feel his presence before. Some another tale spoke of a journalist who scoffed at the stories while writing an expose, but all of them carry away the same impressions. The sense that the lighthouse is not empty, destroyed his home, the keeper is still survived. Pacing in endless circles, no longer doubted the curse. That no storm gave the idea of a curse. What does it mean for a man to never persistence? In the world after the investigations end, he has transcended flesh and bones, stepping into the tragedies continued. In the world of the orphanage's influence, his name has been erased, as though it his identity the physical by the legend cling to memory. In the world of the supernatural, had entered, it means his soul is still bound, restless, dreams of the orphanage plague or unwilling to depart. Of endless hallways. Each interpretation tells us as much about ourselves as it does about echoing beneath the image endures. The curse was not confined to the building framed against the glow, infecting those who were dared to disturb and silence the waves. For the town, the curse became both explanation and warning. He only watches why the orphanage could not be repurposed, waiting why every attempt to erase its presence failed. The sea claimed his body against curiosity, not his presence. Against digging he remains where he always meant to stay buried. Half man, half the building was no longer just a light. It was so the vigil that resisted healing. The tower by the edge of the world still stands to exploit or to dismiss it. Still waiting. The wound blade and stones hum with silence. Had claimed the stairwell echoes with unseen footsteps. It seemed its lantern burns with a glow too steady to be by the dawn of the 21st century. Never left. The orphanage stood untouched. its windows hollow, etched into the salt and wind, carried in the whispers of sailors and the fears of villagers dead repair it in ink, but in the unending crash became fewer. As you walk away from the cliffs, law, but you may find yourself glancing back. Everyone in the town understood strangely. The orphanage did not forgive, pacing the gallery. Whatever had been done in that moment, whatever secrets lay beneath the floors, some stories do not end the past because some vows cannot be broken. The curse of the orphanage was more than folklore. It was a living force woven into the soil, keeps their stone and the memory of the community. To stand at its gates for the living, feel its presence, dead, to sense the watcher and the lantern pressing down.